Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. 3 loaves and a home. I remember Oswin the baker, not for his bread, though it was warm and soft like pillows at dawn, but for that strange silence that began to surround him when fortune turned away. He was a man of broad hands and a round face, always with a dusting of flour on his forehead and a kind word on his lips. For years, the oven of his house smoked before the roosters crow, and the village rose to the scent of freshly baked wheat, like waking up to sweet promises. But 3 loaves, just 3, were enough to make everything collapse like poorly kneaded dough under the weight of time. That winter, when wheat was scarce and coins slipped through peasants' fingers, Oswin trusted his heart more than his accounts. He handed over 3 loaves to the local lord's servant, with the promise of payment at the next fair. But the lord had a short memory and a long pride, and weeks later he had the oven sealed and the house seized over debt. And so the baker, who for so many years had fed the village, found himself without a roof, without embers, and with pockets as empty as the old wheat basket on his shoulder. Oswin wandered aimlessly that misty morning, the scent of his own oven still clinging to his clothes like a warm ghost that refused to leave. He tried the church, already sheltering others, tried his sister's house, sold, they said, even the old barn of Toma, but found only silence and downcast eyes. His steps eventually led him to the abandoned mill at the end of the valley, where the wheels no longer turned and the beams groaned at the slightest wind. There, among warped timbers and the smell of forgotten grain, Oswin laid down his cloak, sighed deeply, and for the first time in years slept without the song of embers by his side. The village whispered. Some said it was punishment for not paying the Lord. Others murmured it was unjust to see the baker, who had fed children, cured illness with soup, and warmed so many dawns, treated like a thief. But Oswin, though wounded, did not give in to bitterness. At the mill he found dry wood enough to relight a small oven. He improvised bricks with clay, built a shelter of cloth and straw, and little by little, like someone humming softly so as not to scare away a dream, he began to bake again, not to sell, but to remember who he was. In the first week, he baked just 1 loaf. The flour had been traded for favors, a night of watch for the shepherd, a basket of firewood for the widow Melis. He kneaded the dough with cold water and stiff fingertips, letting it rise near the timid embers. He baked it slowly, listening to the crackle of the firewood and the soft creak of the mill's wheel in the wind, like an old heart that still remembered how to beat. When the loaf came out, it was small, crooked, and golden, but it scented the air like the first dawn of creation. The next morning a child appeared, then another, and then an old woman, slow of step and wet of eye, who offered honey in exchange for crumbs. Oswin, saying little, shared. People came not for coins or bargains, but because there was warmth there, and bread, and a man who still believed the world could be better if there was something warm to hold in one's hands. There was no counter, no bell, no scale, only a stone to sit on, a lit flame, and the comforting smell of living dough rising in the silence. Over time, the mill grew a soul. A bench made of logs appeared beneath the broken window, and on it sat travelers, mothers with children in their arms, and old men with too many stories and too few teeth. The mill's wheel, still motionless, became a shelf for drying herbs, and the hard-packed earth showed bootprints every morning. No one called it a bakery, it was just Oswin's house, but everyone knew that there, bread was more than sustenance. It was comfort, memory, and kindness shaped by hand. When the local lord heard the gossip, he sent a messenger to investigate. He didn't like hearing that the mill, now full of laughter and sweet smoke, had become a village meeting place again. But Oswin owed nothing. no loaves, no apologies. And even if the Lord wanted to intervene, no one cared about his threats anymore, because Oswin, in his humility, had created something power could not take, a place where bonds were made with crumbs and shared silence. And that, said the elders, not even nobles could buy. One night a storm swept the fields, and the mill's roof groaned as if ready to lift from the world. Oswin spent the night gathering blankets, protecting the little hearth, and making sure the last loaf of the day wasn't taken by the wind. In the morning, when he opened the door, he found 3 men there, soaked to the bone, holding a plank, some tiles, and an old sack of nails. "We came to fix the roof," said one of them, asking nothing in return, and Oswin, with a smile that wrinkled all the way to his ears, put the kettle on the fire. And so, the mill became a home, not just for the baker, but for everyone carrying some kind of loss in their chest. There were no prayers, only the smell of fresh bread seeping through the window cracks like a promise. There was no altar, but there was a table where every slice was shared as an act of faith in the goodness that still lingered in the world. Children began bringing wildflowers, and one of them, little Bruna, stuck petals into the broken glass, turning morning light into a timid, colourful, stained glass. Oswin never spoke much about the house he lost. When asked, he would just shrug and say the mill's embers were calmer, that the birds there sang without fear, and that flour went further when mixed with gratitude. His loaves, once perfect and symmetrical, became different from each other. Some flat, others puffed like cushions, but each seemed to hold a piece of his heart. And perhaps that's why they were so remembered. Not for their shape, but for the affection they carried. Once a merchant from the big city passed through the village and tasted one of those loaves. He offered coins, contracts, a place in his warehouse. Oswin listened in silence, wiped his hands on a linen cloth, and replied calmly, "I already have everything I need, a lit flame, enough flour, and good people to share what I make." The merchant laughed, unbelieving, and left. But those who lived there understood. The baker wasn't seeking wealth, only rest. And he had found more than that. He had made the mill into a home that would never be taken from him again. Sometimes, on the coldest mornings, Oswin would hum softly while kneading the dough. Wordless songs, made of sighs and silences, interrupted only by the sound of dough being folded. The children said it brought good luck and waited by the oven, as if watching a spell unfold. On days like that, the village seemed suspended in time, the smoke rising in spirals, the sweet scent spreading across the fields, and the whole world slowing down just to hear life breathe gently between one batch and the next. As the years passed, Oswin gained new wrinkles and a slower gait, but his eyes still held the same soft light from when he first offered bread without charge, simply because he knew that shared warmth was healing. They say that in the last winter of his life, he left 3 loaves on the mill's window, as if returning to the world what had once been taken from him. And when asked why 3, he smiled with a calm look and said, "Because that's how it started." The next morning, no one saw him go out for firewood. They found him asleep beside the still warm oven, a cloth across his knees and the scent of the last loaf lingering in the air like a blessing. There was no funeral with bells or wailing, only a silent circle around the mill, each person holding a piece of bread as one holds a memory they don't wish to forget. Bruna, now grown, lit the first flame in that oven the next day. And since then, bread has never ceased to be born there, between the old stones and the windows of petals. The mill remains to this day. It creaks on windy nights and blossoms in scent every morning. They say those who arrive there with sorrow leave with their hearts a little warmer, and sometimes, when the breeze blows from the valley, you can hear a whisper of song among the crackle of the firewood and the murmur of wheat, as if Oswin were still nearby, kneading time with steady hands and a serene soul, teaching that losing everything may be the first step toward finding what truly matters. The hermit of the woods. I remember the first time I heard of him, not in a sermon or a book of chronicles, but by the hearth of the inn on a night of stubborn rain when the embers cracked as if they too were listening. They called him the Hermit of the Woods, a name that sounded more like a drunkard's invention than truth. But all it took was a walk along moss-covered trails, beneath trees whispering secrets in hushed tones, to understand that something, or someone, truly lived there, among twisted roots and patient shadows. They said he was young when he vanished, his hands still free of calluses and his head full of debts. He fled without goodbye on a moonless night, carrying only a crust of hard bread and the bitter fear of creditors who knocked at village doors like circling crows. He wasn't a thief nor a wrongdoer, just a boy who owed more than he could pay and feared shame more than hunger. The forest, damp and fragrant with earth, welcomed him like a silent aunt, and in him blossomed the rarest kind of freedom, the kind no one envies. In those first months, he survived like a newborn animal, sniffing out roots, sleeping beneath bent willows, and drinking from puddles the sky left behind in mercy. Silence, at first as awkward as a borrowed coat, became shelter. He learned to tell the sound of leaves when a badger passed, the murmur of water between stones, the distant crack of a branch falling with no audience. Hunger taught him more than priests ever did, and solitude more than any village teacher. Over time, his face took on the color of bark, and his eyes the dull shine of creatures who observe much and speak little. The seasons passed over him like veils, changing the world's attire without asking permission. In winter, he covered himself in dry moss and slept between the deep roots of oaks, where even the wind dared not whisper. In summer, he bathed in streams and gathered small fruits, the kind that stain your fingers purple and promise more than they give. Once, he tried befriending a limping crow, offering raw turnip scraps. The crow refused, of course, but began trailing him from a distance, as if respecting his solitude. Sometimes a villager would claim to have seen him among the trees, a shadow that breathed, but no one dared approach. Children made up songs about him, and shepherds avoided the deeper trails, fearing the calmness in his eyes. Too calm for any man. But the truth is, he never posed a threat. The hermit was made of silence and roots. His world was different, one where coins held no value, calendars served no purpose, and names lost meaning like leaves carried off by the wind. On very cold nights, when the sky creaked from being so clear, he lit small fires hidden under stones. No tall flames, just modest embers, as if afraid to wake the forest. In those moments he spoke to the trees in a low voice, asking them things only solitude knows how to ask. He never got clear answers, but learned to hear what's said without words. The sorrow of dry roots, the sudden joy of an owl in the hunt, the gentle crack of a branch saying, "Here I am," in the dark. Over the years, his body adapted to the woods like stone yielding to water. His feet grew tough as leather, his shoulders curved like old branches. He spent whole days without uttering a single word and still never felt alone. The forest was vast, but within him lived an even deeper stillness. Time made no demands, not yesterday, not tomorrow. Only now, repeating like the song of crickets, the sighing of wind through pines, the steady beat of his own heart against the cold earth. One morning he found a lost goat, dirty, thin, with eyes wide in quiet resignation. He approached gently, held out a handful of roots and waited. He wasn't seeking friendship, only wordless company. After a long pause, the goat accepted. From then on, they wandered together, he and she, like two stones forgotten by the river. They slept side by side, shared the day's leftovers, needing no promises, no understanding. Soon, other animals grew used to his presence. Squirrels left empty shells at his burrow's entrance like offerings. A one-eyed old badger visited on warm autumn afternoons, resting near his legs like an old road companion. And the birds. Ah, the birds. They sang more confidently when he passed, as if they recognized in the slow-moving man a brother with invisible feathers. There was one night, fog lying low, everything like a half-remembered dream, when a little girl stumbled into his clearing. Dressed in rags, crying softly, lost from her parents and the path. He watched her from afar for a while, then stepped forward, offering a piece of root and a calm gaze. Without speaking, he made her a place by the fire and shared his supper of leaves and clean water. When morning came, he led her to the forest's edge, where her mother's desperate cries already split the air. He said nothing, just turned back with quiet steps, vanishing so as not to break the magic. After that, the clearing gained a kind of sacred aura among the villagers. No one knew exactly where it lay, but everyone knew it was there. They began calling it the Hermit's Refuge, and some, in secret, left offerings, stale bread, worn cloth, even bundles of seeds wrapped in linen. He never appeared to receive them, but never rejected them either. Slowly, his presence shifted from fear to legend, and from legend into comfort. As if, even hidden, he protected the village with his serene absence. One spring, a child gathering flowers said she heard a flute far off. The melody was simple, almost shy, but so sweet it brought tears to her eyes. She told her mother, who told the miller, who told the priest, and soon the whole town was murmuring about the hermit now playing music for the trees. No one knew he had found a cracked flute among the remains of an old cart, and that, after days spent mending it with pine resin and linen strips, he had taught himself to blow slow notes, as if rehearsing conversations with the sky. Over time, his music became part of the forest. The notes danced through the leaves, followed the insect's flight, and settled softly on the stream's surface. It was a song without a name, woven from longing and peace, able to soothe even the oldest trees. And when it faded, it left behind a silence so full, it could only be made by someone who had long forgotten the world's noise. It wasn't rare for travelers to stop on seldom-used trails, not out of fear, but reverence. Something there called them to listen, even if there was nothing to hear. On full moon nights, he lit a small lantern made of gourd and beeswax. Not to find his way, he knew the forest like his own hand, but to offer the darkness a gesture of kindness. He'd sit on a smooth stone, flute in his lap, the goat curled at his feet. Sometimes he played, sometimes he simply looked at the sky, letting the fireflies finish the symphony. On those nights, he felt whole, not a fugitive, not a legend, just part of the world's breath. One winter, during a storm that made the branches groan like old bones, a group of woodcutters lost their way in the woods. Snow covered the trails, and the wind erased every attempt at direction. Shivering, hungry, they stumbled for hours until they spotted a faint light, floating like a tiny sun tethered to the earth. Hesitant, they approached, and there, in the clearing sheltered by twisted pines, they found the hermit. He said nothing, simply invited them to sit by the fire, offered warm roots, and wrapped the youngest in a hand-stitched fur cloak. When the storm passed, he guided them in silence to the old oak that marked the trail's start, then vanished again, as if he had never existed. After that, respect became devotion. The priest began including a prayer for the guardian of the forest in his quietest masses, and some women lit candles in their windows on foggy nights, like giving thanks to an invisible presence. The children, once frightened, now spoke of him like a storybook figure, half man, half forest. And the forest, it seemed, gave something back. Harvests near its edges grew kinder, wolves retreated beyond the hills, and even the harsh winters brought a strange, peaceful stillness. The years passed like leaves floating downriver. He, now bent and with hair as white as morning frost, kept the same calm gaze of someone who had learned to listen more than speak. The goat, old and lame, still followed slowly, like a resigned shadow. Sometimes he'd sit before a hollow trunk and whisper words no one else could hear. Perhaps memories, perhaps apologies, perhaps just the old desire to speak to the world, even when the world no longer answers. That final spring, the flute was no longer heard. Moss covered the stone where he used to sit, and birds flew nervously above the clearing, as if sensing the end of a spell. A group of curious yet respectful youths found only a bundle of dry leaves, a neatly folded cloak, and a sprig of rosemary braided with linen strips. Nothing more. No body, no mark. Only absence. And silence, a silence so deep, so full, so gentle, it taught more than any word ever could. Since then, the clearing has remained as it was, untouched, serene, like a forgotten altar. No one dared build there, nor harvest its roots. It became a sacred passing place, where even the winds whispered with care. They say that on misty nights, one might still hear a lone flute note, like the echo of a memory that refuses to leave. The elders would advise, if you hear it, don't seek, just listen. And be grateful, for the hermit of the woods, who once fled the world in fear, found within it a refuge. And in withdrawing from everything, he ended up touching many, not with words or grand gestures, but with the delicate art of living in peace. Some say he was a coward, others a saint, but me, I prefer to remember him as one who learned to make a home out of silence, and from solitude a gesture of tenderness. And in that, perhaps, lies more wisdom than we know. A bridal veil pawned. I remember that morning well. The cold arrived earlier than expected, not with snow, but with that thick kind of silence that fogs up windows and fills hearts with foreboding. It was autumn, and the wind drifting through the village already carried the scent of lit hearths and late harvests. In the low stone house, between the hill and the mill, old Edda slowly folded a piece of ancient linen. Her fingers, marked by time and the soap of countless washings, lingered over the fabric like someone holding a secret. It was her wedding veil, fine cloth, hand-embroidered with threads said to be dyed with wild mallow petals. None of her daughters had worn it. No portrait had preserved it, but there it was, kept as if it was still May, and she a bride with flowers in her hair and hope in her eyes. The village murmured discreetly about the youngest son, Taviel, who had gotten mixed up with outsiders and promises that never came true. There were debts, there were delays, and above all, there was the risk of losing what little remained, the small field and the family name. Edda said nothing. She simply waited by the stove for the knock at the door. When the collector finally came, a man in a dark cloak and weary manners, she did not argue, nor plead, nor weep. She simply handed him a small bundle, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The man hesitated. As he opened it, the fabric slipped between his fingers like a breath from the past. For a moment, he thought he heard distant music, perhaps a wedding bell, or just the wind in the trees. "It's enough," said Edda, and returned to stirring the pot as if nothing had happened. The collector was not a man of sentiment. He had spent years climbing and descending the paths between villages, recording debts, collecting promissory notes, hearing every excuse, from failed harvests to invented illnesses. He had seen it all. But on that foggy morning, faced with that silent woman, and the veil still carrying the scent of forgotten youth, something within him gave way. It wasn't pity exactly. It was a kind of respect, the sort reserved for rare gestures and unspoken words. He tucked the bundle away with unusual care, as if afraid time might unravel it, and promised, without lifting his eyes, that the debt was settled. When Taviel heard what had happened, he said nothing. He stood far too long at the door, gripping the handle with a trembling hand. It wasn't the first time his mother had rescued him, but it was the first time he truly felt the weight of what it had cost. That night he crept quietly into her room and found her asleep in the chair, feet tucked under a blanket, the soup pot still warm over the coals. There was a peace there he didn't know. Not the peace of those who win, but of those who surrender, who give. Taviel sat on the floor beside the loom and stayed there, listening to the wind against the roof, as if trying to learn, in silence, the language his mother had always spoken, the language of quiet sacrifice. The next morning, Edda found him already awake, stacking firewood beside the barn, his face smudged with soot and sleeves rolled up. She said nothing of his change in habits, nor of what had been given to the collector. Between them, gestures had always spoken louder than words. He served her toasted bread and a walnut leaf infusion, and she accepted it without questions. That's how the house endured, through shared silences and humble routines that somehow kept the world standing. And though the veil now slept in someone else's hands, Edda seemed lighter, as if part of the burden she had carried since the altar had finally found its place. The news traveled through the village in hushed whispers, not because Edda had said anything, she never would, but because the collector, a discreet man of few expressions, had been seen leaving the village with teary eyes and an almost devout care for a simple linen package. They said he refused all other pledges that month. Others swore they saw him leaving coins anonymously on the doorsteps of poorer homes. No one knew for sure. But since that day, when Edda's name was spoken, there was a sort of reverence even in the most skeptical voices. It wasn't fame, nor charity. It was respect. And respect there was worth more than gold. Time passed as it does in old villages, slowly, in circles embroidered by predictable seasons and days that blurred into each other. The field was tended, the harvests came, and Taviel slowly rediscovered dignity in simple tasks, mending the roof, selling eggs at the market, carrying baskets for the elderly. He never mentioned the veil, but every day, while folding the house's clean linens, his hands would touch the empty space in the chest like one recognizing a scar. Sometimes he paused, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath, not out of regret, that already lived in him, but of gratitude, that mature form of love needing no declarations, only constancy. One spring afternoon, as daffodils bloomed by the stream, a young woman arrived in the village. She brought with her a small child, a worn dress, and the look of someone carrying far more than just the bags on her shoulders. She asked for shelter and work. Edda, already watching from the doorway, invited her in with a gentle gesture, no questions asked. She prepared a bath, bread with honey, and a bed beside the window. When Taviel saw her for the first time, he dropped the basket of apples and blushed like a boy. Not for her beauty, though she was beautiful, but for something older, more tender, as if in her weary eyes he recognized a mirror of his own story. The days that followed were filled with quiet pauses and shy glances. Taviel showed her the paths through the fields, taught her where the sweetest blackberries grew and which streamstone was least slippery. She listened intently, but it was in the gestures that something new began to bloom. Gathering firewood together, sharing butter, smiling when he came in muddy and crooked-hatted. The child ran barefoot through the yard, laughing freely, already treated like a grandson by Edda, who mended his worn cloak with the same tenderness she once embroidered a veil. One night, when the crickets sang with particular gusto and the heat lingered in the walls, Edda pulled from an old chest a piece of lace that had survived the years. A border from the veil, perhaps forgotten or spared on purpose. She offered it to the young woman with care, saying only, "For when your time comes." It wasn't a gift nor an heirloom. It was a thread of continuity, of redemption unfolding across generations. The woman, her eyes moist, promised to wear it one day, but only if Taviel asked, and he, standing at the doorway, said nothing. He simply walked out to the field, looked up at the starry sky, and for the first time in years felt that his story might yet blossom. The following week there was a market in the village. The bells rang early, and the square filled with voices, stalls, and the delicious aroma of fresh bread. Taviel brought apples, the woman brought cornmeal cakes, and the child ran among the benches selling smiles. Many greeted them kindly, without the old reserve that had once clung to the family name. Edda stayed home, embroidering by morning light, the door ajar and the kettle hanging over the embers. When they returned, they brought back fewer goods but more joy. the kind not weighed by coin. That afternoon, as they hung aprons to dry, Taviel and the woman laughed at something simple, and laughed so heartily that Edda, watching from the window, smiled too. One evening, the child fell asleep before dinner, exhausted from running all day. The house was dim, the lamp's light dancing along the walls, the soft scent of lavender rising from the old wooden floor. Edda sat in her straw chair, gazing at the fire like one watching memories. Taviel approached silently, sat at her feet, and rested his head on her lap, just as he used to when he was little. She ran her fingers through his hair, now darkened by time, and he whispered, "I know what you did for me, and one day I'll know how to give too." Edda didn't answer. She simply held his hand firmly and let the warmth of the fire say the rest. Time, ever patient, continued its work, turning wounds into memories and guilt into care. The young woman began sleeping in the old wooden alcove, and her light footsteps became part of the household rhythm. Some evenings, the three would sit together beneath the backyard arbor, Taviel sharpening tools, she spinning wool, and the boy inventing stories about giants and talking hens. Life moved slowly, like a stream that doesn't rush to arrive, but knows exactly where it's going. And beneath that peace, built with quiet sacrifices, something flourished. Not a new family, but the continuation of an old love, inherited and reborn. Then came the day Taviel, with a trembling voice and a handful of wildflowers, said what everyone already knew. He asked for her hand beneath the crooked fig tree where the birds made their nest. She said yes, eyes brimming, and the boy, laughing, asked if he would now have 2 fathers or 2 bedrooms. They all laughed tenderly. And when they returned home, Edda was already waiting with a basket of sweet bread and the carefully washed lace drying on the table. "I don't have a whole veil to offer," she said, "but I have the thread of the story, and it's stronger than it seems." In that moment, no one spoke. They simply sat together, and for a long while let silence embroider what was already complete. The next spring, the ceremony was simple, as all true things are. The fields were in bloom, the chapel bell rang shyly, and the neighbors brought loaves, green branches, and smiles. The woman wore a simple dress, and in her hair, tied with a blue ribbon, was the lace Edda had stitched so many years before. As she walked toward Taviel, the veil swayed in the breeze, and some whispered it looked like a piece of sky sewn by hand. Edda, seated on the wooden bench near the altar, did not cry, but her eyes shimmered with the kind of tears that do not need to fall to be felt. The collector, now an old man, stood at a distance, leaning against a tree, holding his hat to his chest, as one watches a debt being paid in flowers. And that night, when the moon rose gently over the village rooftops and silence filled the house, Edda lit the last candle and closed the shutters with slow hands. She sat by the hearth, now cold, and for a moment rested her hands in her lap. Outside, the crickets sang, the wind was soft, and in every corner of the house were traces of a love that had endured everything: loss, debt, time. Perhaps no one would speak of the veil again. Perhaps the world would forget. But there, between stone walls and whispered stories, there remained a place where small gestures held the strength of the eternal. And it was there, in that piece stitched together by silence and thread, that Edda finally fell asleep, the blacksmith and the false coins. I remember well the nights when the sky felt heavier than the bellows of the forge, burdened with colorless clouds and thoughts that refused to sleep. In those days, I was merely a man with calloused hands, my face perpetually dusted with soot, and a name no one spoke with affection, only out of necessity. My craft was fire, not the fire of war or love, but the kind that shapes iron with dry, heavy strikes in exchange for little more than a bowl of broth and the promise of more work come dawn. The village knew me only as the blacksmith, nothing more. But there were nights when, between a horseshoe and a scythe blade, I dreamed of coins. Not the ones I received, but the ones I could create. Freedom in those times had no wings. It had the sound of a leather pouch opening, the clink of silver on wood, the distracted glance of a merchant. And it was on one such silent dawn, with embers still alive beneath the ash and the world sleeping in its poverty, that I committed my first act of rebellion. I forged a false coin. Small, flawed, hastily made by the flickering light of a lantern, using the mold of a real one I had received for fixing a gate. I knew the risk. Counterfeiting was betrayal. To the king, the crown, and even heaven, they said. But at that moment, watching the hot metal flow into the mold with reluctant grace, I felt something that hadn't visited me in a long time. Power. It wasn't greed, understand. I didn't long for castles or fine clothes or dinners served by soft-spoken servants. What I wanted was simple, to choose when to rest, to say no to the feudal lord without fear of losing my roof, to buy a slice of bread without owing 3 days of work in return. Every coin I secretly forged carried not only the deceptive shine of silver, but the weight of my accumulated exhaustion. I hid them beneath a loose floorboard where only the creak of wood knew the truth. And even that creak sounded as if it wanted to tell. Little by little, I improved. I discovered that tin gave a more convincing gleam when blended with lead, that merchant monks rarely looked twice at small change, and that during the spring fairs, amid the bustle of stalls and children running underfoot, no one noticed the difference between a real coin and a dreamed one. I began testing them, one here, one there, always with trembling hands and a heart squeezed tight, as if each exchange might make the world collapse. But it didn't. The baker accepted. So did the coachman. And I, returning home, felt something rarer than true gold: hope. In time I began walking with my eyes downcast, not from shame but caution. Eyes were everywhere, in the tavern's corner, among the priory's vines, even in water's reflection, where my own face examined me with doubt. I told no one, not even old Edras, who shared supper scraps with me and had once taught me as a boy to listen to the iron before striking. I didn't want them to know. Not from fear of betrayal, but because what I was doing was more fragile than a sword's edge. A single wrong word, a breath of suspicion, and everything would turn to ash. It was on a morning of thick mist, the kind that makes trees look like whispering ghosts, that luck decided to test me. A man came to the village, not one of ours. His boots were too clean for a traveler, his eyes too pale to trust. He introduced himself as a tax collector in the Baron's service, and no one dared question him. They simply bowed their heads, counted coins, offered sheep, whatever they could. I, foolish with exhaustion and defiance, handed him 2 false coins. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The real ones were gone, and he would not accept horseshoes as payment. He weighed the coins in his palm as if reading the soul of a man, turned them to the dull daylight, and said nothing. Just nodded with a murmur and moved to the next door, leaving behind the bitter scent of leather and a trail of unease in the air. Inside, I was shaking. The forge felt hotter that day, or perhaps it was just fear tightening inside me like a belt of iron. I worked in silence, hammering twice as hard as if the sound might drive away the thoughts. But at night, when the fire faded and the village fell into sleep, my mind burned with the memory of the man's gaze. That week, I forged no coins. I simply repaired plows, sharpened blades, and prayed in silence for quiet nights. But peace did not come. On the 3rd night, I heard footsteps outside. Not villagers. Light, deliberate steps, those of someone used to moving unseen. I hid behind the woodpile, fingers clutching a worn chisel. I saw shadows at my door, heard the hinges being tested, then silence. A silence so thick it clung to the skin. They didn't enter. Perhaps they just wanted to let me know they knew. Perhaps they just wanted me to feel fear, and they succeeded. The next day, no one said anything. The sun rose pale, as if it too were unsure, and the village resumed its slow rhythm. Cows led to pasture, children chasing hens, the chapel bell marking time like an old man who's forgotten why. But I saw the looks, brief, averted, as if my neighbors had felt the same presence and now feared that speaking of it would call it back. Even Edris, who used to knock at my door with news from the mill, passed by in silence. Loneliness never sounded so loud as in that shared silence. And in that emptiness, I understood. I had crossed a line, not just the laws, but the trust of those who shared bread with me. I, who had once been simply the blacksmith, tired, poor but harmless, now bore a secret too dark to fit between hammer and tongs. I thought of stopping. I thought of running. But where would I go? Who would shelter a man who lied in metal and disguised falsehood as justice? And still, at day's end, standing before the slumbering forge, my fingers itched again for the familiarity of the mold. The yearning for freedom, even when wrong, is stubborn as rust. That night I lit the fire again, not for the usual work, but for what should remain unnamed. Every step felt slower, as if time itself sought to stop me. The tin refused to melt, the mold was too cold, and the silence so thick I could hear my own breath bouncing off the stone walls. Still, I continued, no longer just for hunger or weariness, but for the absurd comfort of feeling that something, anything, remained under my control, even if it was only the shape of a false coin in my trembling hands. But fate has long ears and a wicked sense of humor. At the market the following week, when I tried to trade one of the new coins for a strip of leather, I noticed the mistake. The merchant, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, weighed the piece as if it were a sliver of soul, and frowned. "This one has the wrong weight," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I smiled, made a clumsy joke about bad luck, and backed away before others took notice. But it was too late. In a small village, rumors travel faster than carts. And the whisper that began with one merchant became an invisible current, dragging my name through the alleys like mud. The following days were a tight rope stretched over coals. I worked twice as hard, avoided others' eyes, and kept my door locked even in daylight. The scent of metal no longer comforted me. It seemed to judge. I began seeing signs where there may have been none. A priest crossing the street to avoid my shadow, a boy dropping a real coin at the sight of me, as if my presence might taint it. At night, I heard footsteps, always footsteps, sometimes distant, sometimes too near, maybe just cats or wind playing with dry leaves. But my mind no longer allowed the comfort of doubt. It was on one of those nights, when the world slept and the moon was thin as my courage, that I knocked on Edris's door. I said nothing. He asked nothing. He simply offered me a seat, a cup of thin wine, and the kind of silence only the old know how to share. We sat like that for a while, both facing the fire, watching the flames dance like memories. Then he spoke, without looking at me. "You forge more than iron, boy. You forge hope. But false hope costs dearly, sometimes more than hunger itself." His words were not an accusation. They were a mirror, and in it I saw what I had become. The next morning, with the bitter taste of wine still in my mouth and Edris's words haunting my thoughts, I made a decision. I buried the molds behind the forge, beneath hard, cold earth that never cradles secrets kindly. I dug with bare hands, as if I deserved each scratch, each stubborn root. When I covered it all again, I pressed the soil down with force, as one trying to seal an entire past beneath a breath. I did not pray. Words felt too hollow for it. I just closed my eyes for a moment and let silence wrap me like a winter sheet. In the days that followed, I worked as always, but with the weight of someone who had said goodbye to something vital. And strangely, the village seemed to shift as well. There were no apologies, no confessions, no punishments, but the looks grew softer. The baker handed me a loaf without charge that first week. "Too burnt to sell," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. An old woman left a candle lit on my doorstep during a rainy night, and Edris began knocking again, uninvited, bringing old stories and a lighter silence. As if, even without knowing for sure, they had all chosen forgetting, or perhaps forgiveness. Winter arrived without fanfare, carrying with it misty mornings and the distant scent of burning wood from the earliest homes to stir. I continued my craft as before, but something in me had softened. The jingle of real coins returned, sparse but honest, and each felt lighter than the false ones I once hid. In time, my forge became a refuge for more than just tools and horseshoes. Young boys began seeking me out to learn the trade. Thin hands, hungry eyes, longing for something beyond mud and servitude. And I, with a quiet voice and tired patience, taught them to listen to iron, to respect the fire, and above all to know the value of work forged in truth. Sometimes, on nights when the wind howls louder through the boards, I still think of the buried coins. They're still there. Perhaps corroded, perhaps forgotten, perhaps embraced by the roots growing silently. I do not take pride in them, but neither do I deny them. They were part of a time when everything in me screamed for freedom, even if by crooked roads. Today, when I rest my arms at day's end and hear the crackle of dying embers, I no longer carry fear, only memory. And that, for all its ache, still warms me. The shame of the square. I remember that pale winter, when frost etched delicate patterns on windows and the chapel bell measured time like a patient shepherd. The village square, where cobblers hammered soles and spinners murmured over spools of linen, had a space reserved for those who owed more than they could pay. A weathered wooden structure leaning against the dry well, where debtors were chained. It was believed that the weight of those chains, displayed before all, served the people more than the punished themselves. And on that slow morning, with wind whistling through the cracks of the inns, it was there I saw old Emmerich being led, without words, without protest, his head uncovered against the cold. He walked with the slowness of those who feel no urgency to change their fate. His worn boots sank into the frost-hardened mud, each step leaving a mark that seemed to hesitate before fading. Around him, eyes turned away, not in contempt, but out of shame. Everyone knew Emmerich, the old man who mended bent spoons, who helped carry buckets when the laundress's arms trembled. No one hated him, no one wished to see him there. But custom was older than any affection, and in those days, public shame was seen as a bitter remedy, necessary, they said, like nettle oil for swollen joints. The chain was placed gently around his wrist, as if the young man tasked with it feared tightening it too much. Emmerich said nothing. He simply sat on the small wooden bench beside the post, where the sun rarely touched. A crow watched from the tavern roof, and the children, once playing with stones and rags, slipped away in silence. Emmerich looked ahead, as if seeing beyond the square, beyond the smoke-coughing chimneys, beyond the day itself. Some said he was at peace. Others whispered that he'd already left inside, leaving only a shell there, bound to shame. There was a time when people believed that the one who endured the post in silence not only cleansed their own debt, but some part of the world's as well. I don't know if it's true, but that day, as Emmerich sat unmoving, even the dogs seemed to sense the stillness and kept their distance. The hours passed slowly, as if time itself had chained itself to his feet. From time to time, someone left a stale piece of bread on the well's ledge. Not out of pity, too much pity could be seen as defiance, but from a quiet tenderness, nameless, like leaving seeds by the door and pretending not to know who will come. As the sun tilted and rooftops glowed in the late afternoon light, some said the old man was dozing, his eyes closed, chest rising gently, a faint mist of breath escaping his lips. And then, As if something quietly gave way within him, Emmerich slumped slightly to one side, still bound, but already elsewhere. One of the guards approached, hesitant, like someone stepping onto thin snow. But the old man was merely dreaming. Dreaming perhaps of days when he ran through fields beyond the mill, before debts, before winter, before time grew so heavy. The next morning they found him the same, leaning softly like a branch bowed by dew. Still breathing, still there. The blacksmith said it was strength, that only a man with a firm soul could pass a whole night exposed to frost and memory without breaking or weeping. Others thought it was stubbornness, the same that made him refuse help when old age came collecting its dues. The priest arrived later, blessed his brow, and murmured gentle words, but Emmerich didn't open his eyes. He was far away, as absent as bells between mass. The third day brought a thin, constant drizzle, the kind that seeps through cloak seams and wears down patience. Some began to murmur that it was enough, that the lesson had been given, that no one needed more of that example. But tradition was like rain. You didn't argue with it, only learned to live with it. It was only at dusk that the bailiff came, key in hand, and released the old man with a curt gesture. Emmerich didn't thank him, nor did he rise at once. He merely rubbed his marked wrists, as if checking whether he still belonged to the world of those who feel. When he finally stood, his steps no longer carried the firmness of the man who had arrived 2 days earlier. He wavered slightly, as if the chains had left something more than marks, perhaps an invisible weight that would follow him from then on. No one approached, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was as if he had crossed some sacred threshold, one not stepped over without removing one's hat or offering silence. Emmerich walked to the well's edge, cupped some murky water in his hands, and washed his face. Then he moved on, down the cobbled street, under the watchful gaze of half-closed windows. At his doorstep he found a small cloth bundle. Inside were a piece of cheese, a hunk of dark bread, and a tallow candle, signs that though the world was harsh, the people's hearts still held warmth. He sat on the step, slowly unwrapped the hardened bread, and bit off a piece, chewing as if rediscovering the taste of simple things. On that grey evening, no one spoke his name aloud. But each soul in the village carried an echo of what they had witnessed. Not the shame of the square, but the dignity of an old man who faced the cold, the stares, and the loneliness without lowering his gaze. In the days that followed, old Emmerich was seen less often. They said he preferred the forest trails to the village's murmur, that he sometimes sat for hours beneath a crooked beech, watching moss creep up the stones as if it marked time more fairly than the bells. The children, who had once feared the chained figure in the square, now saw him as a kind of silent guardian, and left small offerings at his door, sprigs of lavender, feathers found in the barn, even a copper button someone believed to be magic. He accepted them all with a quiet nod, as if he understood the meaning folded into each gesture. One evening, when the sky wore a bluish grey and the air carried the sweet scent of burning wood, someone said they saw Emmerich smiling. He stood on the old bridge, the same one we crossed during processions, watching the water rush beneath the worn planks. A young man had asked if he still felt anger for what had been done to him. Emmerich, in a low voice, eyes like embers nearly extinguished, replied only, "Shame, when it comes in silence, doesn't weigh. It teaches." Then he turned, as if saying farewell without needing words, and disappeared around the bend in the road where the willows danced with the wind. From that moment on, no one ever spoke of Emmerich as a debtor again. His name, once whispered with pity or reproach, began to be remembered with gentle respect, as if he had become part of the village itself, like the church bell or the tree at the square's centre. And curiously, no one was ever chained there again. The wooden post remained, but the eyes that once saw it as a tool of correction now looked at it as a relic of something that no longer made sense. Some said it was out of shame, others compassion. But everyone knew deep down that Emmerich had changed more than his own fate. He had changed those who witnessed him. Years passed, generations came and went, and the story of the old man who endured his punishment without a word became one of those tales told on cold nights between sips of barley tea and the creak of a chair by the fire. Some doubted the details, others added scenes, some swore he was a disguised saint. But I, who saw him with my own eyes that frosty morning, remember him simply as a man, flawed, tired, but whole. And sometimes, when the wind drifts through the village's narrow lanes, I feel I can hear his steady steps among the dry leaves, as if he still walks there, free of chains, carrying with him the lightness known only to those who have borne the weight of the world. And so, on nights when the moon rests quietly above the slanted rooftops and the cold invites silence, I like to remember old Emmerich, not with sorrow, but with that tenderness reserved for those who passed like a breeze, gentle but impossible to forget. He left no children, no inheritance, no letters, but he left something subtler, more lasting. The memory that dignity does not depend on the position we're in, but on how we rise after we've fallen. Sometimes, when I walk through the old square and see the post covered in moss, I leave a small piece of bread or a lit candle beside it. Not out of superstition, but gratitude. Gratitude for that quiet lesson, for that winter when we all learned to listen more with our eyes than with our ears. And perhaps somewhere far off, where trails vanish in the mist and the willows still dance with the wind, old Emmerich walks on, free of chains, guiding with gentle steps those who carry the world's weight on their shoulders, reminding them that there is strength in silence and redemption in simply standing tall. The storyteller. I remember him as if it were yesterday, though an entire lifetime has passed since I last heard his voice. Hoarse like a dry branch, yet always dancing through the air like smoke from the market ovens. People called him simply the storyteller, though he had a christened name, a wife who left too soon, and a son who became a ferryman up north. But there, among vinegar stalls and strings of garlic swaying in the wind, he was just the man of stories, the one who paid for bread with words, settled debts with fables, and sweetened the patience of bakers with tales of kings, ravens, and lost love. In the days when copper grew scarce and even the priests hesitated to charge for mass, his voice became currency. There was no change at the stalls, no promissory notes in anyone's pockets, but there was always room for a well-told tale. All he had to do was promise a story by sunset, and the butcher would hand him a marrow bone, the milkman a warm sip from the bottom of the jug. And he delivered, always. Beneath the faded awning of the old cobbler, or on the blacksmith's threshold, he would begin to speak, and the square would fall silent, as if listening were, at that moment, more urgent than eating. They said he was born on the feast of St. Crispin, when the bells rang late because of the rain. Others swore he came from far away, from plains where birds speak in dreams, and the wind smells of stewed apples. No one knew for sure, but all agreed that when the storyteller arrived at the fair, the clocks seemed to slow. Coins felt lighter in the pocket, cues moved more gently, and even stray dogs lay at his feet, as if they understood this man offered shelter, not of roof or stone, but of memory. He never told the same tale twice, though some claimed otherwise. The story of the haunted mill gained new ghosts each season, and the saga of the enchanted fisherman always had one more fish, or one less kiss. But no one minded the variations. His words were like wool, coarse in places, but warming. Children followed him as if he were a Pied Piper in worn-out shoes, and the elderly, oh, the elderly smiled with their eyes closed, as if their memories were being stitched back together, thread by thread. There was an unspoken pact between him and the market folk. Anyone who accepted a story in place of payment never asked again. It was as if by some ancient instinct, everyone knew that the right words are worth more than coins, and last longer too. While copper disappears at the bottom of a chest, a story echoes, spreads, becomes a seed in someone's ear. And so the storyteller passed years without ever owing a thing, though he possessed not a single coin. His reputation grew like ivy on stone walls, silent but impossible to uproot. One dry autumn, when the fallen leaves resembled crumpled parchment, he told the story that would make him a legend. It was at dusk, beneath a plum-colored sky, when even the church bell delayed its chime. So many gathered that the baker forgot the oven, and the gatekeeper left the city gate unlocked. And he began in a low voice, like someone revealing a secret. He spoke of a king who lost his crown for not knowing how to listen, of a boy who paid for his freedom with a poem, and of a woman who wove her sorrow into songs. At the end, he asked for nothing. He merely stood, adjusted his threadbare cloak, and walked away slowly, leaving behind a silence fuller than any purse of silver. In the days that followed, no one saw him. Not at the Monday market, nor at midnight mass, not even among the quiet faces who sought shade beneath the old Wells oak tree. But his stories remained, in the mouths of children repeating them between bites of apple, in the hands of merchants drawing them on soap crates, and even in the prayers of elders who swore they heard his voice whispering through the firewood's cracks. It was as if he had left pieces of himself in each syllable, and those generous pieces asked for nothing in return, only to be remembered. In time, a custom emerged, always on Fridays, near the last light, to gather in the same corner where he used to tell his tales. A spot beneath the burlap awning, between the vinegar barrel and the crooked scale at the greengrocer's. There, the townsfolk began to share their own stories. Small ones, sometimes foolish, other times so sorrowful that the air grew heavy, but they told them. And those who listened paid however they could, with bread, with flowers, with quiet attention. And thus was born the word stall, where nothing was bought or sold, but where things were remembered, and that, they said, was worth more than any coin. I remember the first time I went there. It was winter, and the wind had teeth. I brought a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth and a story inherited from my grandmother about a dog who saw ghosts and a mill that sang. I spoke with a trembling voice, stumbling over the words like someone crossing thin ice. But even so, they listened. An old man handed me a dried apple in thanks. A woman smiled at me with teary eyes. And I, for the first time, understood what the storyteller had left behind. Not just stories, but a way to make time fold in on itself and warm even the coldest of hearts. As the years passed, the market changed. New stalls appeared, the price of wheat rose, and the church bell was replaced by a bronze one that no longer rang with the same sweetness. But the word stall remained. No tax collector dared disturb those who gathered there, for there was no debt, only sharing. Some said that when the wind blew from the north, you could still hear the storyteller's raspy laugh, mingling with the rustle of the tents, as if, somewhere between the pages of time, he still sat there, elbows on a crate, eyes glowing like embers beneath the shadow of a hat. There were children who had never met him, yet told his tales with the conviction of those who had seen it all firsthand. They spoke of the king who talked with ravens, the horse who could dream, the bridge that appeared only to those who wept. Stories passed from mouth to mouth like weightless relics, but with a value only the respectful hush of a listening circle could measure. And no matter how many times they were told, each retelling was new, each voice added a note, a pause, a different perfume of remembrance. Some, the older ones, still spoke of him as if he might return. As if, on an afternoon of low clouds, he could suddenly appear among the stalls, adjusting his cloak, whistling that nameless tune that always preceded a good tale. And maybe, I thought, they weren't wrong. For some presences aren't measured in footsteps or shadows. They're measured by what remains after, in the warmth of a memory well told, in the shiver of a sentence spoken at the right moment, in the way everyone leans in a little closer when the story begins. And that's how I learned. Not every payment needs a purse, not every debt weighs on the shoulders. Sometimes a tale tossed into the air is worth more than a sack of barley. Because in lean times, when even the bell hesitates to ring, it's the word that feeds us. It sweetens the silence, softens the weight, turns a cold night into a warm memory, wrapped in the clink of mugs and the distant sizzle of pots over fire. Today, when I walk through the market and the sky begins to glow copper, I often stop there for a moment. I lean against the old post where he used to sit and close my eyes. Around me, the sound of vendors wrapping fruit, the warm breath of ovens, and the murmurs of those who still tell. And for a brief moment I see him, not with my eyes, but with my soul. The weathered hat, the gaze that knew more than it ever said, and the certainty that as long as someone is willing to listen, no story ever truly dies. It only rests, waiting for the next fair to be told again. And so I go, night after night, letting his words walk with me, light as golden dust on the road. For some inherit land, some inherit coins. I inherited stories. And I've learned that in times when no one has any change left, memory becomes the most precious treasure. Each tale, an offering, each silence around it, an ancient promise that beauty can indeed be born from scarcity. So if one day you pass through a market at dusk and hear a voice carried in the rhythm of the wind, pause for a moment. It might just be a vendor calling out, or maybe, just maybe, it's him, the storyteller, fulfilling one more debt, paying with what he always had in abundance, time, words, and the gift of making even the hardest hearts beat to the rhythm of a good story.